There we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I'm your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, May 1st. We made it to May. We will hear the presentation, Craving Community, the Increments of Great Neighborhoods. Okay. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar. And for your content questions related to the presentation, you can type those again in your webcast toolbar, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Up on your screen next, there we go, is a list of our 2020 sponsors, all of our APA chapters and divisions that have joined us this year. So thanks to them for sponsoring and for making all of these webcasts possible. Today's sponsor is the Urban Design and Preservation Division, and we will hear from Margaret Rifkin from the division here in just a few moments. So thanks to the Urban Design and Preservation Division. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. We have way more coming down. Actually, we're booked out through August at this point. So we're collecting information, we're getting everything ready for registration. So be sure to check back on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast for the latest and greatest information so that you can register. I want to also mention this is a screenshot of our webpage. So you'll see the different tabs up at the top. You can check out our prior webcasts, which are the PDF copies of those. And distance education on that tab, we actually have 3 distance education sessions available, so on-demand sessions. One is for law, one is for ethics, and actually the third one is today. We will have all of these available on demand for credit through the end of December. So be sure to check those out if you need any more credits. Okay, next so today's, sorry, I have a friend in the background here. Today's session is worth 1.5 CM credits. Again, like I said, it is also available for on-demand viewing through the end of the year. To log those CM credits, just head over to planning.org, log into your MyAPA account, and then you can search either by today's title or the event number, which is found there on your screen. And let's be friends, like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our sessions. And also be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We record all of our sessions and make them available on YouTube. We have over 300 recorded sessions. We have almost 3,000 subscribers. So make sure you head over to YouTube and subscribe to our channel. Just search Planning Webcast in the search box there in YouTube and we'll pop up. So with that, I am going to now turn it over to Margaret Rifkin of the Urban Design and Preservation Division, and she is going to take it from here.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. As you heard, I'm the director of our division's webinar program. We encourage you to join the division if you haven't already, and thank those of you who are already members, and especially those of you who responded to the short survey that we emailed to you. As you know, we offered an incentive to you to respond to our survey, and that was to be entered in a drawing for a copy of the book featured in today's webinar, Increments of Neighborhood, a compendium of built types for walkable and vibrant communities. And I'm pleased to announce that Chris Brimo from Tampa, Florida, won a copy of the book and should be expecting it to arrive in the mail shortly. Our next webinar will be Tactical Urbanism Response to Crises with Mike Lydon of Street Plans. Mike and his business partner, Tony Garcia, wrote the book Tactical Urbanism, Short-Term Action for Long-Term Change. That will be the book topic of our division's first virtual book club, which will be the evening of June 1st. So all members, be watching for a notice in your email about the book club. And for those of you who would like to join us, join the division and come to the book club. We have additional webinars planned for the rest of the year, including the topics you see on your screen. And we urge you to watch for the dates and for more topics, which we're working on already. With that, I am delighted to introduce Brian O'Looney, who is a design architect master planner and a principal at Torty Gallis, pictured right there on that window. Torty Gallis's design philosophy, as many of you know, is based on the very strong and intertwined relationship between planning, urban design, and architecture of communities. They have been involved in over 100 mixed use, mixed income projects across North America. And as you may know, they also have an international portfolio. Brian lectures on a range of topics related to creating livable communities, and he has also guided award-winning projects across the country. He led the team that created the book, Increments of Neighborhood, a compendium of built types for walkable and vibrant communities. Brian is here today to talk to us about Craving Community, the increments of great neighborhoods. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Margaret. It's great to be here today. I'm excited to talk to everyone. I'm glad for those who joined this webinar and not Lin-Manuel Miranda's, which is happening at the very same time. So I am going to just go and dig right in. Give me a second here to click the right things and get everything going. Okay, so here we go. So go full screen. That, and I minimize this. Okay, great. Okay, so this is the contents of what we're going to talk about today. And all right, what we we're here to talk about are the contributory factors that make wonderful communities and the kinds of neighborhoods that folks really gravitate towards and want to be a part of, particularly now that we've been cooped up for some of us a month and a half already. And looking at charming and quaint communities, trying to discover and figure out what aspects of them make them places we gravitate towards. And looking at it both in their current state, this image of Short North, just north of Columbus, Ohio, as well as some historic photographs that don't necessarily look the same anymore. This is Broadway in San Francisco from 1957, plus or minus, a view of New London, Connecticut, where I come from let's just say 1925 to 29, somewhere in there, judging by the cars. View of Lincoln Park in Chicago. These are all very different neighborhoods, and they have their own character. And what we're going to focus on as part of this presentation is really what the architectural urban increment is that creates that character. And you can have a variety of different kinds of increments that create charm. Even, it can be large scale like Chicago, lower scale but intense and dense like St. Petersburg, but there's a rhythm and a pattern to the architecture that defines the community there. And similarly, a community can have multiple types of increments. There are two images on the left are from Charleston, where the feel of the place and the street is very different, but nonetheless unified and welcoming and has a charm that draws you towards participation. When we do our design projects, particularly in existing communities, and definitely in the ones that are transit related, we often take a moment and try to map out those increments on the plan, on the community. So the diagram in the lower right is a graphic, a map overlaid on a satellite photo of the facade increments, the sizes and scales of buildings as they're expressed as uniform architecture. So some are larger and some are smaller. But as we're looking at incorporating our project, which was generally much larger than the predominant scale of the increment, we saw that in order to get it to fit better in the community, we wanted to create scaling devices and facade identities that were smaller. And so the image in the middle reflects that approach related to smaller identities across the street. And then as it segued down the hill towards the train station, it moved towards a larger building identity that related to some of the larger identities that you can see in the upper right. The civic ones in the middle of the page, and the upper right are the private sector identities. But how they're looking at the character of the community, what the size and shape and predominant form and mass is, and then how what our project can relate to that. Another New Jersey community we're working in right now is Somerville. And again, when we look at this project, which is replacing an old rail yard and town dump on the other side of the tracks from what is their existing main street, which has a lot of charm and character, as you can see in the images on the left. Again, we looked at the height and scale and just a general run of facades as they march along the streets that we would be then connecting to with our project. Also thinking about, because this particular project had so much that it was defining on its own, coming up with an architecture that was appropriate to relate both to the character of their community, but also to historic trends with transit-oriented development, and nods to architecture, architectural experiences that have happened since the predominant building types and styles in Somerville were made. So this is the place that we arrived at, currently being bid. There's the transit plaza, the drop-off plaza with some retail, the meeting hall for the jurisdiction, and lobbies for the residential components. There's a modern identity, which is off on the far right, but generally they're more traditional transit lifestyle-oriented facades that were part of what this jurisdiction was looking for when they were approving the project. But again, you can see the scale, you can see the increment that we've kept up. This is one step up, a little bit larger than the increment on the other side of the tracks on Main Street, but it is scaled to itself, and it does segue to the identities along Bridge Street here and other parts of the community as it moves down the street.
Brian, before you move on to the next slide, could you go back? Sure. I normally don't interrupt with questions until the end, but there are 7 or 8 folks that want to know what the color coding means in the black box, what all of that represents. Yeah.
Sure. The colors are they're really just different identities. Not for these plans, but on some plans they have been style related. So if some are classical or modern or a different style, we have used it for that in neither of these examples. And these examples are just simply different facade identities and different breaks in the just showing where one vertical architecture is different than the next. But we have used it in other places to represent style, but we did not do that here.
Thank you.
Sure. So that was a good moment to have a question, because now I want to talk a little bit about what is community in a post-COVID-19 world. And a part of our worldview, we do a lot of mixed use projects with intensive retail. I'm going to show a few examples now from particularly with our work with Steiner Associates, Yarmir Steiner. And he, long before we got to where we are now, started talking about retail as 2 different models of retail in the US. There's a retail places that are need-based, the supermarket, Costco, Walmart, those kinds of places you go that are commodity oriented. You typically are shopping by carts. And then there are places that are want based. They're slower, they're pedestrian oriented, they're about engaging, and you walk around and and it's part of the experience is surprise and what's new and what's out there, and exploration and discovery. One is about getting your needs met right away and getting in and out. The other is about being part of a community and lingering. And for the wants-based model retail, I think the change that was already happening has been accelerated in the COVID world. We've all learned how to use Instacart and get Amazon deliveries and get food brought to our homes, and I don't think that's going to change. I think in fact many I've talked to are going to have a Costco experience, but through Instacart. They'd rather have them go to Costco for them and bring items to their house as opposed to having to go there. People will still go occasionally. There is still a discovery to be made. What's new? What do they offer? But we're looking to avoid crowds, and certainly few enjoy the experience that is shown in the left image, right? Whereas for the want-based places, we're looking to get out and have a moment where we get away from our daily lives and have moments of wonder and discovery and experience still. We will need to do it in places that allow us to have social distancing. I pulled this image because this one sort of showed folks that were kind of separated from one another as opposed to being crowded into this green, which it can support. And I'll talk about this later, but when we design public rooms in our projects, we try to design them so that they can work well at many occupancy levels. And for the next few months, we're going to be thinking about places with lower occupancy levels. These particular places, and this is a Steiner development, there's a little bit of a formula to how they work, and there's a diagram in the upper right you can see that talks about that, where there's in the lavender color, there's a sort of a intensive circulation zone that's crafted in a way that allows for a sequential experience, and then that place can be attached to over the long term. These want place centers serve as a gathering place. They don't stand on their own. They need because they're regional, they need this larger community. And I had another slide that I pulled out to support them. And again, they are crafted to create sequential experiences. It's not a one-note place. There's you experience new moments and new destinations along a generally contained place. The figure 8 is a diagram that's used a lot, but it's not always the case, but it's an example in these 4 here. And again, the idea with these kinds of these kinds of retail centers is that they do attach outward and extend and allow for growth and augmentation as time moves forward. Again, this goes back to the issue of places that are designed for various levels of occupancy. That view of a very populated Bethesda row is not how that the Muse is going to be used for the next month or 2, or hopefully not 6, but could be. And so but that place still will feel wonderful as we're social distancing and walking through it, shopping, going to the restaurants, living as we are expecting to do in the next few months once we get over the hump. And so again, the thought for these kinds of places are creating that sequential series of experiences, and part of that is what are the moments and what are those increments along that community. Again, this comes from looking at charming historic communities, and in the case of this project, which is just outside of Dayton, It really had to do with looking at what is appropriate and comfortable and relevant for folks in this area. So one thing that we do oftentimes is, particularly when we're doing historical research, is looking at the sort of postcard era, partly to just understand what was beloved. It had to be something that people were interested in celebrating a little bit for that image to end up on a postcard. And so this particular graphic shows a variety of postcards in and around the Dayton, Cincinnati area that all are identities that are derived from the Chesapeake, Ohio Railroad expansion and growth, and what that increment was at the time, that what was financed, what was built, how communities designed themselves and decided how they would be arranged. And how, and basically at the time, oftentimes these buildings were built by one entity, whether a bank or a supermarket or a hardware store, or residential small residential developer. These created these moments, and some are civic buildings, but there's a scale and a size that is appropriate and comfortable and relevant for this region. And so when we were looking at designing the identities for this particular project, we looked at those elements in terms of what would feel right and appropriate. The image on the left is actually a project that was more budget constrained, but the planning still incorporated a increment and a thought about a architectural range of sizes that would come together to make an overall place. And why that's, and it's important that these are not so overdone and prevalent that they're not real. We're very critical in these, and I'll talk about this in a second, to make the identities anchored. There has to be front doors and reasons for the identities to be. It also gives the identities an opportunity for ownership. So even though the capital was paid for by others, the brands that are in these buildings in the lower levels have an opportunity to really take control and own the frontages and the building identities. And so over time, there is a hope that these new brands will come in, new retailers will come in and own their frontage and own the building identity and redo the ground plan and maybe even start to talk about what happens above. But there's that opportunity for ownership, even though those brands are not full-time owners in this project. Similar to the image on the right, that Monterey building, that's a rental project, but that one tenant, and this is a duplex building, then they personally went in and planted those flowers and dressed the door in a way to show pride of ownership. And so recognizable increments allow for participation, personal investment, and ownership, whether at the residential scale on the right or the commercial scale on the left. And so part of the book was, while there's lots of great aspects to those neighborhoods that we showed at the beginning, we focused on what increments made great walkable neighborhood, what you can add to that attachable fragment to make a neighborhood better and better. What can you grow? What you grow with? And we broke the book down to 7 or 8 categories of products. They're not all buildings, so I can't say building types because there's things that aren't buildings in there. But we started with private sector buildings, and then we were asked by a publisher to add the public buildings. And then what turned out to be the most controversial, we added mobility types to the book as well. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But all of these types are what make a great walkable environment work. And they all have influence on one another. Imagine a chessboard and the way the queen and the pawn have influences on, and the knight influence how all the others are located. That's how we're looking at how each of these buildings have an inflection, how these types, which are really private sector driven, have an inflection onto the greater whole. And so part of what we did was talk about building type in terms of the community level, and therefore we talk about the term of increment for that. And this sort of influence is starting to be measurable. Companies like RCL Co, who helped with the book, and Myers Research, these are market-driven companies. They look at, if you have a multifamily residential building and there is a coffee shop or a bar that opens up, they can actually start to quantify what that influence on the rent will be. There's a planner called Supernormal out of Boston that are doing very innovative things for the city of Pittsburgh and Boston, where they're in Cambridge, but in Boston, they were hired by the city to look at what the change would be if the city promoted third places like coffee shops in neighborhoods that didn't have them. And so the city of Boston is now going through a process of helping to finance new coffee shops to engender better communities within the city. The book is arranged by, as I said, by sections. The sections have spreads that talk about each of the particular types. Most are 2 pages, some are 4. But all the types that are in this book have certain attributes that make them relevant to contributing to a great walkable community. They're occupiable, they engage, they allow engagement from inside to out. They're pedestrian oriented, they enhance connectivity, they have recognizable elements that allow for personal investment and ownership, doors, so those are the elements that drive what was a type that went into the compendium. So let's talk a little bit about what's a barrier to community. Obviously, highways and rail lines even will stop a great community from growing and one neighborhood from extending. It's an obvious barrier. This is a notorious example from Miami on the right with I-95. Other barriers are simply blank walls, right? Where an example on the left is a building that we've recently been fortunate enough to help tear down at the former Walter Reed Army Medical Center. But again, it was a building that it had nothing to do about community. Really, everything that it was considered was important to it was about the inside. And you can actually, these images, the rest of the images are all places where communities have reacted to negatively to blank walls in their environment. Overwhelming institutional monotony is another example. And this can be from governmental sources, as the Soviet example at the left, but also an American example, the Government Center in Atlanta, in Albany, New York. But they can be private sector too. The Stanford Town Center in Connecticut is a huge shopping mall that is deliberately denigrating the street in order to promote its interior and to promote the interior realm over what the street face is. And then there are public-private examples like Constitution Plaza in the middle, which was a combined effort that took out a neighborhood which at the time was thought to by the powers that be to be an eyesore, but in the end they didn't see the value in what was at the time an Italian-American community. But actually both the Albany Center as well, Government Center there, also took out what was a predominantly Italian-American community that was not valued by the folks that were in power. This is a question about large monetary governmental policy. If you want to talk about that, I've actually taken a section out of this presentation because it got too long about that. But there are policies that are very pro community, which work incrementally, such as the J51 program in New York City that supported Soho and its regrowth and rebirth and the renovation of all those great buildings there that are now extremely expensive because of that investment. And also types, again, because of those attributes that we just went over, even types that we talk about as promoting community can not promote community. They can be a negative to a community. And so one example of that is a missing middle type, the stacked flat, which in this case is an unwelcome type in Bayonne, which is called the Bayonne box, and you have articles about them wanting to limit and create zoning that would not allow for these kinds of types. And it's not necessarily the typology of the inside, it's more of how that is related to the outside. And and it's bad design with the unwelcoming wall and the overscaled and underscaled architectural elements, but it's also the frontage, the security fencing here, the promotion of the vehicular over the pedestrian. All these make the Bayonne box not a great missing middle type. And there's this great essay from maybe 10, 15 years ago now by Chris Leinberger that many of you are probably familiar with, about the 19 types of real estate products that were financeable at the time. And he wrote a great article saying, here, this is what you can get built today. This is what banks allow you to do. And the top 5 are all for sale product, like starter homes and move up homes and retirement facilities. But the lower items are all income producing projects that you can get a loan for. But all of these were based on the suburban model, and they relied on that last image on the lower right. They're all dependent upon surface parking as part of their model of success. And so for years, we were only promoting with our financing systems these kinds of real estate products. Other barriers are a little more different. They're requirements, and they come more out of the public sector, that are really storage aspects. A stormwater pond is designed to be active 1 out of every 33,600 days. 10-year storm that means that this thing is sitting fallow the rest of the time. All these items, right? That ends up being a hole in the place, in the neighborhood. Now, over time, maybe these trees grow and it becomes a contributory part of the community. There are precedents for that. I'll show you these images from Mawson Lakes in South Australia. This is a phenomenal project where the stormwater facilities, they have different rules, so they are able to integrate them better into their community. All this above can flood. It doesn't typically flood, but it allows to flood, so it has that capability. At the same time, it's integrated into the water management system. This is a drier area, so they're more akin to our west coast here, but they tie this system into a water treatment plant that creates a purple pipe system for gray water that serves every unit in the project. So their potable water demands are 50% less because all this stormwater is getting put through a system that then goes to a purple pipe system that then goes to toilets, that then gets reused and put back into it gets either again brought into the purple pipe system or cleaned up to the potable level. But the stormwater system it's understood that this is not impediment, but part of the overall community, and it's integrated as part of the planning efforts. And there are rules that we have on our books that prohibit this from happening in the States, and we can talk about that, but there are great precedents out there, and I use this Australian example as a better way of doing stormwater storage. Similarly, parking is a storage use, right? In the building code, it's very clearly called out as a storage use. And like stormwater, it's designed for peak usage at one part of the year. So the regional shopping malls on the right, they're designed, the numbers that are in the codes are from the second Saturday before Christmas or the Saturday after Thanksgiving. And those numbers are used to design the overall facility with 15% overage. So you take what they think the occupancy is going to be and you add 15% so they can circulate. So you're automatically starting with 15% empty. But when you go to June or July, that parking lot is 45% to 50% empty by design. That's how they're made. So we're designing the emptiness into the project, but from the engineering of it. And you can see this in some of these great diagrams by Seth Goodman. where he takes the zoning codes from across the US and does a quick graphic of the active space in color versus what the spatial requirement for parking is. So this apartment in green on the lower part of the screen requires that much parking next to it on the right. This is the diagram for dining space. So you have a restaurant. In some places, you're required 3 times as much parking for that restaurant space. An office is similar. Office is sort of 1-to-1. So if you average this all out commercially, it's about 1-to-1. So what does that mean? That means if you're doing a 1-story building, half your land has to be 1-story commercial building, half your land has to be parking. If you're doing a 2-story building, more of your land has to be parking. If you do a 4-story building, the majority of your land has to be parking by law, by rule, right? And so that's why the suburbs look like they do, no surprise. And what we're trying to do is make places that people want to be in. This is a regional shopping destination, but for some reason in this diagram, they chose to put the parking in the middle of the place. And that's, that's putting your storage uses in the middle of the active environment you want. This is like putting stuff from your closets in your living room. And when you do that, you're called a hoarder. And that's what our planning does. You're effectively taking storage and putting it in your front. And this has other negative consequences. This is a satellite photo of downtown Oklahoma City. Everything that just got highlighted in red are surface parking lots that really mostly sit empty because they've now built some parking structures in the middle. But those surface parking lots in red translate to about 400 acres, which if you averaged out the density that you would get by putting townhouses, half townhouses and half low wood multifamily buildings on here, you could get 20,000 units that support 40,000 residents, 12 supermarkets, and 75 restaurants in the land that's there, which would make a far more vibrant downtown for Oklahoma City. And this comes from a presentation I did for folks in Oklahoma City. But this is what they have now, and this is not an active, vibrant downtown, right? So, but there are contributory parking and mobility solutions. When you look at, and I'm sure most people on this call are familiar with the notion of the transect, with less dense elements on the left and more dense buildings and types on the right. There are different parking solutions that are contributory, different mobility solutions that are contributory from low density places to high density places. In high density places, you start having transit and bike and other kinds of mobility, and we've included that in the volume that we created. But at the lower end, really particularly with the American model, we're having to find ways of arranging surface parking because of the costs. And when you look at the types and costs of off-street parking, it's a lot less expensive to build a surface parking space than it is an underground space. It's almost 10 times the price for an underground space versus a surface parking space. So when we look and all these, if you try to make a nice surface lot and use pavers, it's double the price of the asphalt lot. So when we look at coming up with solutions for parking, one has to understand that the more dense solutions are often a lot more expensive and more challenging to integrate. So you only see them typically in high urban locations, like the elevator garage is in the heart of Detroit, and the compact speed ramp garage where it's a flat plate with a speed ramp. You find those in strong metropolitan areas like the suburbs of Washington and Chicago and New York, et cetera. Whereas as you move down, the other solutions are more viable. Street parking, it's the one thing that makes a space seem a little more active. The spaces the cars are more transient, so it feels more active because of the transience of it, and they allow, as you all know, the protection from traffic to the pedestrians who are on the sidewalk, and everything else in between in these. There's also a lot of other very finesse, different kinds of parking facilities like double helixes and stack lots, but I won't go into them. But they all have their different price points and their different ways of helping to contribute to a great public realm. One challenge is that when you try to make suburban places walkable, if you're thinking about wrapping a parking load on the outside and making all four sides of a block walkable, it takes a lot of land to do that. And so the upper left example is a project in Florida, which is it's commercial on the left, but then segues very quickly to self-parking residential and a little bit of walk up on the right. But that block contains its parking load, and that block is 320 by 750 feet long to get great edges to it. You know, the mantra for very small blocks is very hard to achieve when you're trying to store parking. The lower right in the red box is the grid at the same scale of downtown Fort Worth, which is a 200 by 200 grid. South Lake Town Square in the middle, on the upper part of the slide, that is a deck in the middle of the block surrounded by two-story commercial uses. Those 2 stories commercial uses are supported by that parking load in the middle. And I'll get to that in a second. And then similarly, for 4-story commercial uses, you would need an awfully big lot, a block, which is 500 by 870, and to the point where we worked on a project when I was at David Schwartz's office called Frisco Square up in Frisco, Texas, where on the highway edge of the project, we left that long big block, but inboard, we started creating moments and gestures to break down that large block, but allow for that simple parking facility in the middle. Again, this being an unadorned deck in the middle that doesn't require sprinklers and a whole bunch of other things that might get more expensive if it got more integrated, like the example in the middle for Miramar, which is a 4-story block that's single loaded and wrapped, a much harder set of types to get built because the garage is way more expensive, it's got to be sprinklered, and the types are more expensive. That single loaded corridor is a lot more expensive residential building than the residential buildings on the left. So parking is inefficient horizontally, but it is more efficient vertically. This is a diagram from Southlake that shows that in the same height of a 2-story commercial building, you can get 4 levels of parking, and that's how those blocks work. So, and Southlake was designed to start out surface parked day one, and then over time grow and eventually trip deck. So each block can be built surface parked, make a great place on the 2 sides. The 2 sides of each block come together to make a frontage until decks are needed, and then you can wrap those decks. And that's in fact what's happening now in Southlake, which is pretty exciting to see. Parking standards, one more quick couple comments on parking standards. And housing in particular, the cost of a bath in a unit of multifamily is somewhere around $7,000. The cost of a kitchen is anywhere from $12,000 to $17,000 to get that built and installed. You can probably get it built cheaper, right? So those are typically the most expensive parts of a unit outside of the drywall and the wood studs. In some jurisdictions that you work in, they require 2 spaces, and sometimes that has to be underground. And so you're requiring $50,000 to $100,000 worth of parking to support a unit where, you know, you could theoretically build it for a lot less, but it doubles the cost of the housing because of something not intrinsic to the unit itself, but the mobility solution that's been privatized and added to that unit. And so transit also has a double whammy, or the privatized parking also has a double whammy on the private sector, in that it hurts the yield of the land. So this is 3 building examples, all Torty Gauss buildings. They're all type 5A maxed out buildings. So that means that they're maxed out 4-story tall wood buildings on their site. And when you max out that and you're surface parked, you can only get 30 units an acre. When you max out a type 5 building and you got a parking deck in it, in a wrap, you can get 55 units an acre. When you max it out and you're transit served with bikes and other mobility solutions, you can get up to 80 units an acre yield on that with that type. And so the privatization of mobility impacts both the cost of the unit per unit, because you've got to build that mobility solution, but it also impacts how much yield the land can get at a particular building type. All right, so we'll go to building types now. These are lower scale single family types that all create community. There's the basics like side stairs and center stair colonials and Cape Cods, but there are also some interesting types been developed in more walkable places like the Coach House, which has tuck under parking, Katrina cottages and such. And again, but most of these types, again, which we're trying to make great frontages, often have their alley service on the rear, as the middle image shows. Townhouse types are interesting in that there's a lot of variety that isn't necessarily understood by the planning community. The difference between a 16-foot townhouse and a 20 and 25-foot townhouse is huge from the perspective of the person who's living in it and the developer. Even the difference between an 18 and 20 is there's a lot of that can be achieved in a 20 that can't be done in an 18. For example, in a 20, you can put 2 bedrooms side by side on a typical floor, which is not feasible in an 18-foot unit. In an 18-foot unit, you can park 2 parked cars side by side in the back, which you cannot do in a 16-foot unit. In a 16-foot unit, you can park 1 car in back and 1 car in front parallel, which is not really doable with a 14-foot unit. So these are all things, and then you can go up the spectrum and there's more capabilities and things that you can do. Typically, you can start to wrap a stair in a wider unit like a 25 as you go up the trench. So even with townhouses, there's a variety that happens per type that then impact the way the building talks to the street. You really can't get more than 2 windows on a 16-foot townhouse, but you can start getting triplet window facades on 18s and higher, for example, and that impacts how the building interacts with the street. There are other interesting kinds of attached housing. This is an example from Adelaide and a project called Lightsview that's very interesting. These are single-story row houses. Typically, this isn't done because land costs, developers want to get more out of their land, so they'll build multi-stories to get more stuff and develop more. But in this case, the developer devised this type and it was successful. They also, at the same project, this is also Lightsview, devised these really interesting 12-foot wide units that were, it had a very distinct market for recent divorcees with kids, where there was a den room in the lower level that could double as a bedroom when the kid visits, but there's a main bedroom above and then a sitting area behind, and these were very successful units for them. There are other kinds of units that are, called, that others have talked about, missing middle. I'll breeze through these, but these are all, the next couple are self-parking types. That is that they're like townhouses in that there's multiple units, but they all park themselves. So you don't have to worry about finding parking for them. So this is one that Torty Gallus devised called Charleston's. These are 2/2s. There's a parking space for each unit. There's 2 stacked town houses on top of each other. English basements are similar to those. These are corner manor house units. These are duplexes that are attached, courtyard duplexes, typically great senior product. These are the English basements with a unit on the ground floor. Other interesting types are stacked ranches. These are elevator served buildings, but the units are huge and are great for downsizers. So if someone's moving from a big house and they're buying a house in the south and they want to still have a house in the northeast, this is a type that's been built. This is the inside of one of these units. They're rather luxurious. But one thing that planning, the public realm is a result of both zoning codes and building codes have limits. And this diagram describes the cap on each of those tranches of the units. So there's the International Residential Code, which is the IRC, and they're limited to 3 stories, allow townhouses and duplexes and single-story houses, but nothing more beyond that. The next tranche is wood construction. This is actually a podium there, so it's not quite right, but that's a 4 stories of wood, limited to 55 stories. You can build it with a podium below to get under that, and some places allow 65. The next tranche is type 3, which is an enhanced wood building type that comes from the Chicago tradition. Originally, this was intended to be masonry walls and wood floors, but the wood folks said, well, wait a minute, you're calling that masonry wall a 2-hour type, and we have a 2-hour type too. So they allowed 2-hour wood walls to suffice for this type in most jurisdictions except New Jersey, which doesn't, and others that don't allow that. The next tranche is light gauge construction, which under type 1B in the building code can go up to 12 stories. So you get 8 or 9 stories of the light gauge over a concrete podium. And then in the unlimited type 1 construction, there are, you can easily build out of concrete on the far right, but there are other kinds of proprietary systems that are used, like tunnel form, that come in a little less expensive, but they put limits on how the buildings are formed. Or they create, they're very regular and they force the architecture in some way or another. It's important to understand the building code because sometimes the zoning code won't take preference. This is an example where at the time the zoning was at 7 stories and type 3 was allowed to go up to 6 stories. That's since increased. You were allowed 5 stories of wood plus a concrete podium at the time. And we chose as a team not to go for that extra level of development, because if you built that one extra level, as we've shown in that design on the lower left, that would have required all the units in the building to be built to that higher level of construction costs. So you would have gone from a construction cost that was around $150 a foot for every unit to $250 a foot for every unit. And it's better for the pro forma just to leave this down a story and just build it all out of wood. For multifamily, there's a lot of different types. There's walk-up, where the ground floor has to be accessible, but you can have stairs for the rest of the units above. There are elevator-served buildings, the Texas Donuts we showed earlier, podium buildings that have the ability for either more units or retail below under a concrete podium, and then multifamily high-rise, as we talked about. So when you start thinking about placemaking first, when you're devising types, you start coming up with unique types. And particularly when you're thinking about retail places and connectivity. Conventional retail is typically built out of bar joist buildings. So when you're looking at them in construction, this is what you see. You'll see steel columns and bar joists and a metal roof. Other types that have been devised under the codes are these live work units in new urbanist projects. This is Kentland's here. There are these stacked wood units. These are a little different. The live works are fee simple, so they're limited. These are 1,200 square feet on the ground floor, and that limits the users to units that are retailers that are comfortable in 1,200 square feet. So you'll get a lot of real estate agents, hair salons, and nail salons in this type. This building tries to resolve that a little bit. It's also wood construction. Let me go here. But what it allows is a little bit of connectivity on the ground floor. So there are townhouses above a ground floor that allows flexibility in tenancy. So this building here has a Rent-A-Center and a Starbucks in it on the ground floor, and a liquor store. But upstairs, and so those are larger uses that would not otherwise fit in a live work, but can be built at the wood financial scale, as shown here. Another type that we've seen is where you're doing, again, the townhouses above in the wood, but you build the ground floor out of concrete. But this is intended for the future, that there's an understanding that there may be a need for more commercial space in the long run, but in the short run, we need a use for them today. And so they're built out day one as residential, but over time, if you look in the upper right, the first image is the current state, and it's designed to be where these wood knockouts can come out and go to commercial, to become commercial on the ground floor. This is a master plan where we made a main street, and there's lots of housing getting built around it. And as that housing gets built, it'll energize and develop the need for more commercial space. And that's what these buildings are for. In other places, there just isn't the money for bar joist and steel construction. There you can do commercial buildings up to a certain size in wood, and this is an example from New Albany, Ohio. These wood buildings, office above, restaurants on the ground floor. Some other examples that make great frontages. On the upper right is a 20-foot wide building, plus or minus 2025, that lines a parking lot behind. You can see on the left of the image, but makes a great frontage that allows the continuity of the place to be continued. On the lower left is a huge liner building with mostly medical office on a parking garage in Carlisle and Alexandria. And then the rest of the images are all different kinds of residential liner buildings. These are single loaded towns along parking garages. There's examples from Texas in the Domain and Bee Cave, and then one from Meisner Park in Florida. Other types that promote walkability, promote active frontages are moving large format users to upper floors and having smaller users on the frontage with parking behind the smaller users, and then also maybe a little on the upper floor. So on the upper left is Torrey Gallis's Social Safeway, where there are small retailers on the ground floor. The supermarket is on the second floor. Behind those smaller retailers is a parking lot that's covered. The lane with the red car going up it leads to a parking lot at the back that is at the same level as a supermarket. So for those who want the conventional approach with the cart, they can go in and just go that way to the store. Otherwise, they can park below. There are now many other examples of these kinds of buildings that have all been built in the last 10 years. In Philadelphia, along Girard Street, there's I think it was originally a Pathmark, and now it's an Acme. There in Fairfax, there's a Target that's on the 4th floor with a bunch of levels of garage below and retail on the ground floor. Tyson's West has a Walmart on the ground floor that's wrapped by smaller retails and used in an existing garage above. And then DC USA has a garage underground, retail on the ground floor, smaller retailers, and then large format users above, like a Target. And again, all with the goal of creating activity at the street frontage, not having blank walls, making vibrant frontages. And so let me see how we're doing on time. We're okay. So when you start thinking typologically, you can create interesting solutions that you would not normally come to if you were thinking from a pro forma perspective automatically. These are all buildings that are coming from a project called the Cotton District outside of in Mississippi, outside of the Mississippi State at Starksville, where the developer, a gentleman by the name of Dan Camp, used a variety of different building types, particularly these small student cottage units. Sometimes they're only 1 story, sometimes they're 2, but created individual homes built at a very low price point with scale and a level of thought that started to create community and neighborhood. Sometimes the ground plane is upgraded. There are places where the walks are brick. Some of those brick walks pre-existed and they just tied to them. And other places they've redeveloped and added some character to them. He's mixed it up with 12-foot wide townhouses on the upper right and some interesting low scale mixed use buildings. So these are flats and duplexes over retail. I mean, all these types are mixed together to make it what is a wonderful walkable district. The people who live here, they have cars, but they don't typically use them. They walk to school, they walk back, they walk to shop, they walk to the restaurants. This is a neighborhood Torrey Gallis did many years ago in Celebration, Florida. That's not in the main heart of Celebration, but again, it was typologically based, mixing a lot of different kinds of housing product, townhouses, duplexes, stacked product, and regular walkout multifamily to create neighborhood. And so they feather from one another. These are 2-story towns that feather into a stacked product at the corner that come around and create moments of that influence the architecture in the neighborhood and gesture to place. This is another project of Torrey Gallis's. It's at George Mason University with faculty, primarily faculty housing. Again, the majority of it is townhouses and stacked, but there are these other building types like the one that's on the upper left from the book, where there are 2-story units over one unit on the ground level. That one unit serves as an accessible unit, but the units above create a form that is a little stronger building type that we can use at corners to emphasize key moments in the urban plan. And we've used this product in many projects. We've done it in New Haven and in other places. And in New Haven, we used a more Italianate style to be appropriate for that community. So again, type and style can come together to enhance place. This is a great project of incremental thinking done by Stefanos Palzoidis and his group, Amul Palzoidis, where this is a TOD project at Del Mar Station, where different types are assembled to get together to make a hybrid court district that where there's a multifamily building and an office building and parking garage below and walk-up types and townhouses and stacked units all brought together to define courtyards and mews and the transit station. There's even a restaurant building in the back. All that comes together to create place and form. And sometimes you can design the plan to stretch the typological mix. So it can be, depending on where the marketplace is, the plan on the left has a block that is all towns and stacked, so which is lower level density. But if the market is, for this project, which is at the Wyandanch Station on Long Island, it turns out to be more robust, a multifamily Texas donut product can get put in there in that same block. And that block is designed for either type to allow flexibility over time, depending on where the market goes. And so, and then there's just a question of quality and place. And so I'm going to show a quick project here. This is the last project I'm going to show that talks about how one can create a little more a rhythm and intricacy in a place while still meeting the program, and hopefully by doing that, developing a place that has more value and more interest and desirability in the long run. So this is a site plan for 2,000 units adjacent to a lifestyle center where the program was for 2,000 units. One way to do that would have been to put type 5A 4-story wood stick buildings across the whole site. And that's what this plan shows. And we would have been able to do that, and it would have cost $120 a foot to build all those buildings. And that's one way to approach this. Another way to approach this is to think about it a little differently, a little typologically. Starting with the place that we're trying to make in the middle, start with less intensive uses, a little 2/2s and stacked flats, and maybe some towns to create the day one place. So you create a place that has a little more ownership, a little more typological variety that segues into these larger types, that then moves up into walk-ups and parking podiums, and then the Texas donut buildings we had to begin with, and then finally those last blocks end up being the blocks with that make up the density. So these are more expensive than the original unit buildings were, but by this time you have a place that's established and hopefully the value is there. And because these types are type 1, if by chance you wanted to build more, if there was more density, more value, you could even get more there. So what happens is you create a place day one that's hopefully more desirable. And so what you do is your construction cost in that phase one is much less, right? But the price point for sales is probably higher. Those are more desirable units, they're more value. So what you do in the end is the profit spread in that first phase is much stronger, which is safer for your development pro forma and program in the end, that you're going to get more money out of that way of thinking. And hopefully you're able to use a little bit of that money to reinforce the place with better landscaping, better placemaking, more benches and things that make that a really unique destination that again drive desire and make those long-term multifamily buildings viable. And you're still making money in the end, but then you potentially could build more and make more money. And so that's the thinking that we hope others would be driven to, and that's why we put the book together. And so that's where that's most of what I have to say today. So thank you for your time, everyone.
All right, wonderful. So let me pull up our questions here. And yeah, we have a lot of questions, but if you do have questions, folks, feel free to type those into the chat box, and we will see what we can get done here today. Okay, so the first question: how can local government encourage, if not require, bad designers to design buildings to respect local scale and context? It seems basic design tools to address scale are no longer taught in architecture school.
So I'll just give one example that we've run across. So the state of Texas, many of you might know, passed some laws recently that prohibited local regulation of materials and such. This generally has been supported in the Houston area markets and generally been not welcome in the Dallas area markets. What some Dallas area jurisdictions have done as a response is required design books on the part of master planners and developers that offer these as part of their, as they go through an entitlement, so that there's a level of scale and style that's enforced privately. This is the important point. The private developer is the one that has to enforce the book, but the develop, and that's a part of a development agreement, but the approval is not put in place until that book and those standards from them, in the case of the real estate, the master developer, and then the builders that come in after that master developer, they have to follow those standards. So that's one solution that's being that came out of those Texas rules recently, and so they're requiring these master plan books that require scale. They require door yards. They're not requiring. The developer, as part of their agreement, are proffering that they're going to on their side of the table do these things, and the overall approval doesn't happen for the master plan until those planning books are in place. That's one way that can be done.
Thank you. Next question. What regulations work best for eliminating blank walls? Transparency requirements? Is there a certain percentage that seems to work? What is the best route?
So we hate transparency requirements because generally they're not well considered from a percentage standpoint. They either require too much or too little. I think you can require openings and door and entrances. Having requirements for active entrances is one way to resolve that. If your developers are building residential, that really just means that the ground floor units have to have a door to the street, and we've seen that being both offered automatically by developers and us. We just do it automatically in our work. And oftentimes that's an easy way to do it. In more commercial projects, that you can limit blank walls and describe and talk about where the active frontages are. The challenge is that you have to define that there are going to need to be A streets and they're going to need to be service streets, and so you have to talk about what's served and what's not served to get there. You can also show some of these types, some of the liner types that we have and I didn't show any of the commercial liner types, but there are commercial liner types too, single story retail that are 12 feet, 13 feet deep. You have to understand that that's not often viable unless it's a larger lifestyle-like place that's managed by a retail company that understands that. But then those kinds of companies get it, and they're typically trying to avoid the blank walls. In a downtown environment, you can reinforce the buildings that are there and talk about having an A side if it's Main Street and lesser frontages where those are.
Thank you.
Tough question.
Next question. Do you have any examples of townhouses on lots that are not flat, that have grade change along the fronting property line?
Sloping, well, we do. In fact, 18 is. Let me find it. So, and it may look flat. This particular project is in Pittsburgh. It's on a very steep set of hills, so you can start to see some of that grade change, the 4 steps here to 6 steps here. If you're talking about going that way and the other depth, there are plenty of products that jump a floor. The 22 in the book does that. So this 20-foot type here in Denver is I believe the street is a story higher than the alley at the back. And so the type has the garages in the back are down a floor in this particular building type. So yeah, they exist and they're not hard to implement. You can sort of see that in the photo up here, how that all works with the alley being lower in the back.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think they were specifically looking for something from like left to right. So that example there is perfect.
Yeah, so yes, and then there's, this, typically the grade is not flat. So usually you'll see that, and there tends to be a lot of stepping, and it's a question how the developer or the builder is more comfortable. Sometimes they like to build, and it depends on the code. These are stepping too. You can start to see it here. Mm-hmm. But they're really just going with the grade. Sometimes they try to build them flat and then build steps up, and then the last one has 5 steps and the bottom one has 0. Again, you could have a very refined set of frontage, either regulations or standards provided by the private developer that talk to those issues if you preferred one methodology over another.
Okay. And speaking, you mentioned code, and we'll kind of jump into some of that. Are you aware of any zoning ordinances that require ornate landscaping in front of the building frontage, regardless of the type of use?
Require landscaping, yes. Require ornate.
Maybe they mean really specific.
Yeah, I don't know of any. I can't think of any case where I'm sure it exists, and if with enough time I could come up with one. Maybe Carmel, just because it's so lush, but I don't know other. I have to look into it. I can't. I don't know of any. But if I was to look, I would look into Carmel. I would look into Nantucket, maybe. Other than those, and there may be requirements. There's some jurisdictions in South Carolina that have some intensive buffering requirements, but they're more suburban. I mean, but those are, but in terms of intensity, that's the only thing I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay, that's fine. This is interesting. Can you give more detail on the conversation that allowed projects, the structured parking to be developed as the population, as the need increased? Can you speak more to that?
Sure. So we've done I'll go back to those plans. I wonder if this image here, there's more to it. Yeah, great. So this whole plan here, which is Frisco Square, this was designed, and let's see if I can draw on the screen here. Remove this. I can use this tool. It's fine. But now you're sorry. So in this, I showed South Lake before. In this plan, everything I'm outlining in gray, and it wasn't built this way, unfortunately, but everything outlined in gray, it was designed so that, let's see if I can get another color. That was built as a, let me do it highlighter. This could all be surface parked. So the idea was that you made this attachable realm day one that could all be surface parked. And then anytime, and then once you got to those next uses and those blocks, then structures that have to get built. In the end, they've actually built some structures up front, and they've integrated them into buildings. So unlike this plan, which envisioned less expensive separated decks that were unsprinklered, though what's being built now are attached to buildings and therefore sprinklered and a little more expensive. But this was a plan where the connective tissue was in all that commercial 4-story buildings could have been built surface parked in those lands, and then those footprints that were parking lots would then have to be redeveloped as buildings. And when that happened, those decks were tripped. This was a David Schwartz plan. How do I clear? That did that. The South Lake plan did that. Baldwin Park's plan, which we have just one graphic, maybe I can blow that one up too. Let's see if I got that here. I do. It's really neat. So this plan, again, most of this is now built. This is, and this has a public supermarket in it, in the plan. This is all intended to be surface parked, that's surrounded by lower density types. The last 2 buildings that are now built here that just went up are these 2 buildings at the water that have the first decks in Baldwin Park, and those have been, at least one of them has been built. The second one might be built now too. So that's another plan where that's been done. And then again, South Lake, which I showed, where and the plan wasn't, there was an adjustment to the plan. Those folks who know South Lake, there's a modification where they created more retail, a greater retail place in the middle, but the theory still played out. It was surface parked that created the vision for the place, that sold the vision for the place, that had people buy into that thought, both retailers and homeowners, and then from that vision, once it was sold, that made the place valuable enough so that the structured parking was viable when the time came to build those garages.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What is a reasonable minimum green space requirement as a percentage of the site? The question says, it appears that a lot of the development presented is building with paved surfaces and little vegetated landscape areas. So again, what is a reasonable minimum requirement percentage of the site?
I have trouble with minimums because invariably they create externalities that aren't foreseen. Green, sometimes the green space requirements are so onerous that they end up making projects unviable because they're just too much green per what could, you have, in order to build all that, it ends up not making there's not enough there to support the green. It really depends on, and in that economic equation, it really depends on what type of stuff is being built. If you're building New York City, you can build Central Park. If you're building a small residential neighborhood, and it's really how much land are you influencing? If you're preserving what exists already, that's a different equation than if you're adding new parks that you have to plant trees for and street trees. So it's a multivariable question that there's too many variables for me to answer directly. But generally, we're not a fan of minimums and try to find more qualitative ways of describing what the goals are. So, it's not just about the green, but what kind of green and how is it meant to serve the place and the community.
Okay. If you could get out your crystal ball, we have a couple questions.
Okay.
Related to the future. So how should Typology accommodate future walkable communities that no longer demand as much fixed retail as in the past, like what you started out with today?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I'll say parking too. I thought you were going to go to autonomous vehicles. So with both of those, so interestingly enough, it's happening already. You're seeing a lot of shopping malls now backing off portions of their properties and turning them into symbiotic uses. So a great example around this area, I'm in Washington, in Columbia, Maryland, Howard Hughes, General Growth built a residential district on what was originally part of the parking lot for the mall, but also land that just was set aside that really was never needed to support the parking of the mall because they built decks, and therefore that land wasn't required. So they built a district that then is connected to the mall and supports the food court. Those the people there, who knows, are maybe getting 3 to 5 meals a day, meals a week in that mall, and it's helping energize that place. So that's one way. So an anchor store goes away, and then they add these districts. And I don't have any I can talk to, but we've done a few plans like that. Some we've done. We had one approved in Lombard, Illinois, where there was out parcels on the mall, where we created a district that is connected, has ability to be connected to the mall in the future. And depending on which anchor stay or go, there's different ways that those thoughts can be achieved. So a lot of, particularly the retail developers with huge institutional assets, are already thinking this way and thinking creatively about it. One of the challenges with those assets is agreements that anchor stores have requiring approval of any changes to the property. This is a big challenge. Some have used this as leverage against the developers to extract things from them, either lease extensions, reduced rent, you name it. There have been fights. The famous one in the Washington area was the White Flint Mall, where the developer had an agreement, knocked down the mall anyway in order to create a better place, they thought, but the anchor store sued them and won a case for them taking the mall away. In the opposite direction, there's the example from Syracuse, where the redevelopment, the mall developer wanted to add an extension to their mall to create a new retail environment, so that a competing jurisdiction wouldn't create a competing smaller discount mall. They wanted to add this, but when they went to all their anchors, the anchors all asked for a pound of flesh, and in the end, that they couldn't develop it. And so they went back to the community and say, we would have loved to add this great piece of to our mall that would have added to the tax base of Syracuse, and then so the redevelopment authority in Syracuse said, fine, we'll condemn them. And so they condemned. They did a line by line item condemnation of the lease clauses for that mall, and I think that may still be in litigation. But that's but having one lower court ruling. So it's unclear what will happen with that kind of stuff, but it's challenging. In smaller retail places like neighborhood centers, where there's a lot of energy, we're seeing a lot of additional redevelopment. So in the area near the Twin Brook Station here in Maryland, suburban DC, the shopping centers there have added residential buildings right to what is a surface parked neighborhood center, grocery anchored center, and they've done very well with that. And again, it's synergistic. The folks living in those multifamily units, they can walk downstairs, go to the restaurants, go to the supermarket. When you live in a residential building where there's a supermarket below, it's a completely different lifestyle. I mean, it's my favorite projects. We've done a number of them. You no longer need to go for that weekly shop, although these days you would. But when things go back to normal, you can come home every day, go to the grocery store that night, and decide at that moment what you want to eat and what you want to do and how you want to cook. And maybe there's already something that's prepared there that you would just take upstairs. And it's a very different way of living. And consequently, the units we design for these projects are different because you don't need as much storage space. You don't need as much cabinetry in these units because people don't need it for their weekly shop. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Let's keep going with this. So with the current situation that we're in, do you think it will create a demand for less intensive development?
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I think we're all impacted. We're all going to internalize what we're going through now and think about the future in different ways. So there may be folks that choose, particularly if the vision for autonomous vehicles becomes true, they'll choose to live more remotely and allow the autonomous vehicle to get them there and have a commute that's longer than they have now, because they can make that commute part of their active lifestyle. They can communicate and watch movies and do whatever they want to do while they're through it. So that I think will allow those who are fearful or want to live more remotely to live more remotely. I do think it'll also have us within urban areas rethink the way we've allocated the public space. Throughput is challenged when autonomous vehicles happen. Right now, today, if you were able to get an autonomous motorhome, you could drive it on 5th Avenue, 56th Street, 6th Avenue, 57th Street, 6th Avenue, 56th Street. Keep doing that loop 24/7. As long as this thing could refuel, your fuel cost would be less than the rent for any of the residential around that area. That's a problem. That means a lot of people are going to choose. There's going to be big throughput issues in our cities. And I think cities are going to say, we don't want these vehicles anymore, and choose to pedestrianize more of their cores, which is happening. And there's already considerations for that now, partly related to COVID. But there will be greater needs, even with autonomous, there's already autonomous trains. Once there's a possibility for autonomous buses, that's really going to be a game changer, because then jurisdictions will have to think about, what are we allowing for transportation through this corridor? How big a vehicle and how often the frequency do we want? Because it'll, the labor part of the equation may start getting removed, and then the question is going to be more about throughput and about frequency, and it's a totally different game. And in fact, an upscale bus system may serve more folks than rail transit. And there's a what's his name? There's a transportation planner, Chris Stapleton from Australia, who's very passionate about this issue. And you should have him talk at some point, because he talk about how he feels that buses can serve a larger constituency than rail networks in the future, particularly with autonomous vehicles. So the answer is, yeah, I think it's going to impact us. I think we're going to create more space for pedestrianization in the cities, and others are going to want to be more remote. And then those in the burbs, we'll social. I think we'll all have some measure of social distancing, even when COVID is long gone, just as part of what we do in the future. We're no longer going to be so. Maybe at some point we won't care anymore, but I think it's going to be part of our program, our future. And I think transit systems have a big challenge right now, because I think they're going to really have to work through touchless movements through their environments. We're already looking at a lot of touchless movements in what we do for multifamily. Even before COVID, shopping malls, I don't know if you were aware, a lot of them were removing doors that you opened at the front of the mall by hand with the sliding doors. My guess is that shopping malls, if they're not doing it right now, in the next 3 years, every door going into a shopping center will be a sliding door that are activated when you pull up to it. So those are some of the things that I could see happening because of what we're going through.
Okay, thank you. Hey, it's 2:30. It's time to wrap up. So Brian, thank you for joining us today, and to the Urban Design and Preservation Division for hosting today's session. And they do have more coming down the pipeline, and we are recording this session. It will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. And we'll also have a PDF of the presentation available soon. So again, thank you, Brian, for joining us. Everyone, thanks for joining us. We had over maybe like 650, almost 650 people on the line today. So
Wow.
thanks for being here, and everyone stay safe, and we'll talk next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.